Our next speaker will be Ms. Slater, President of Family Watch International. She's the chair of the United Nations Family Rights Caucus. She's the director of several documentaries, including the award-winning documentary that you will see in Partiality today. The Best Interest of the Child is also one of her documentaries. In her panel today, she will present this new documentary, in part, The Porn Pandemic, the devastating impacts on children, family, and society.
So we've talked about pornography, and maybe we'll do some question and answers regarding that, but in the shortness of time, I'm going to move on to the second possible root cause of the sexualization of children, and that's comprehensive sexuality education. Now, when I say this word, this term, it's going to mean lots of different things to everybody in this room. Everyone's going to have a different concept because this kind of education has never been completely defined. What is it? Is it different from sex education? If so, how does it differ? Claims that are made about comprehensive sexuality education that we've seen in reports, in statements at the UN, we hear it constantly, is that it teaches youth life skills, it lifts people out of poverty, it promotes gender equality, promotes sustainable development, and wow, it even prevents sexually transmitted infections, it's going to solve the HIV/AIDS crisis, prevent teen pregnancy, stop violence against women. It's touted as the answer to many of the world problems we deal with here at the UN. You know, the other day, a gentleman gave me this term. He called it controlled ambiguity. He said, this is what happens at the UN, and I thought it describes a lot of what happens in negotiations, where nations agree on a word that's kind of ambiguous, so everybody can decide for themselves what it means. And this is kind of what happens with this comprehensive sexuality education. But I'm going to tell you what different people have said it means or what it concludes. And we'll start with Caucus. Wendy talked about Caucus, which is the Sexuality Education Information Council of the United States that was kind of offspring of the Kinsey Institute. And they say that sexuality education seeks to provide an opportunity for young people to question, explore, and assess their own and their community's attitudes. So it's about attitudes, changing norms and attitudes in society, gender, and sexuality. Then you have the UN rapporteur. Let's see what he thinks comprehensive sexuality education is. He gave a report to the General Assembly, the UN rapporteur on the right to education, and he says that in order to achieve the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, you must have comprehensive sexuality education. So it's necessary for you to have help. And it must happen from the outside of your schooling, so it must happen early. And part of it is you need to make individuals aware, and since this is for their right to pleasurable sexual experiences. Notice this kind of philosophy stemming from the whole Kinsey philosophy. And even talked about abolishing guilt feelings about eroticism. International Planned Parenthood Federation, in their publication that was distributed at the UN in New York, they say that young people are entitled to sexual pleasure and how to experience it, different forms of sexual pleasure, that's important to their health and well-being. And so they've crafted a lot of programs that teach children the various ways to find sexual pleasure. And this is one of their curriculums they launched in New York. And they claim that the priorities for this kind of curriculum was established by all these UN agencies, like it's mandated. Just a few excerpts from this curriculum. There's a question and answer section on masturbation, orgasm, ejaculation, oral sex, sexual fantasies, and sexually pleasing a partner. Brings in some of the controversial issues that are discussed here that children are supposed to be learning about sexual minorities, how they're treated, discussions on homosexuality. We all know how controversial these things are, and any given person in this room who were teaching such a lesson would probably teach it from a very different perspective. And yet we're calling for this for everybody, but who's teaching it and how are they teaching it? As we've done a study of comprehensive sexuality education programs, we find that most of them have a number of these elements. They teach children how to obtain sexual pleasure. They teach children that they're safe if they wear a condom, but they don't tell them about the failure rates. They teach children to masturbate. They encourage them to experiment sexually. They teach them anal and oral sex can be safe. Promiscuity is a right for them. And many times they denigrate the religious and cultural values of parents. And they try to provide this education without the consent or knowledge of parents, often. So we began with talking about dangerous sexual ideologies. This is kind of indicative of a lot of programs where you see that they're teaching children things like, at every point in your life, you can choose if and how to express your sexuality. They're not taking into account the development of the brain, that the brain is not fully formed until the early 20s, and the impulse control and all the things going on in a youth's brain. They don't necessarily always make the best decisions when they're told out to make these kind of decisions. Most sexual behaviors involve some levels of risk. It's up to you. You determine how much risk. No guidance on how to make good decisions to prevent having any risk, especially we're going to learn from a speaker in the middle of an AIDS pandemic where this risk could be a life or death situation. They ask children to ask themselves, am I ready? The children ask themselves. Only you can answer that question. Talk to your partner. Your partner might talk you out of it, right? Going to other children to decide if you're ready for sex. So what does comprehensive mean? A Planned Parenthood counselor in the U.S. was recently caught in an undercover video where she thought the person she was counseling was 15 years old, and she taught her techniques of sadomasochistic sex that included instructions on gagging, whipping, and asphyxiation as part of the sexual experience that was acceptable. Well, just in the last month or so, there was an article about a Jessica Burlew who may spend 25 years in prison. She was only 16. Her boyfriend was age 43. In some places you call that pedophilia. But she was engaging in one of these sexually erotic games where you do asphyxiation, and her partner lost consciousness and he died. And she told the newspaper, he didn't say the safe word. We were taught you have to say a safe word. These are the kind of things that are being taught to children. Dr. Miriam Grossman has written this book, You're Teaching My Child What? And she helped provide some of the slides that I'm showing you. She found this from one of the sexuality education programs. Using correctly condoms are up to 98% effective. Okay, that sounds like a pretty high rate. But we know the Guttmacher Institute did a study that showed when children engaged in sexual activity under the age of 18 for 2 years, there was around, I think it was either 23 or 25% failure rate that ended in pregnancy. So we know that the condoms are not always going to work for the children. And again, in the middle of an AIDS pandemic, which we're going to hear about, that could lead to AIDS, a life-threatening disease. So is comprehensive sexuality education really comprehensive? Does it teach about oxytocin, which is the chemical that's released when a mom nurses her child and it bonds her to her child, but it's also released in greater amounts in a girl when she has sexual relations with a man, and so she bonds to him. Oxytocin shapes the neural circuitry of trust and trust adaptation in humans, so she'll start to trust and want to be with the person who she has sexual relations with. It kind of explains there's been studies done on depression in young girls, that they're having higher rates of depression if they have more casual sexual partners, because there's biological things going on in their brain and in their body that are causing this that they aren't told about in comprehensive sexuality education programs. In fact, oxytocin switches the love and trust feeling on, and it switches caution and aversion off. So what does UNESCO say about sexuality education? They created these guidelines to go to all the educational departments in the world. Well, they say starting at age 5, you need to teach people that, boys and girls, that their body parts can feel pleasurable when touched. Masturbation, it's not harmful. Age 9, both men and women. So first they teach about self-pleasure, and then it's about getting pleasure with somebody else, another person. They need to learn about orgasm at this young age. 12 to 15. Not only can they learn they can get sexual pleasure with their opposite sex, but now as they get older they need to learn that they can have it with the same sex. And again, this fixation on sexual pleasure and orgasm. Now this book, it was given to me by a member of the delegation of Mexico back in 2002 at the World Summit of Children. This was published by UNICEF and the Department of Families. I'm sure it's probably not in circulation now, but it was at the time, but it will just give you an idea. It was meant for pregnant women and adolescents. This is what it says they should learn. Here's the Spanish, but I've got the translation here. Situations in which you could obtain sexual pleasure. A sexual response that is directed toward inanimate objects, animals, minors, and non-consenting persons. And I ask you, why would an adolescent ever need to know that they could derive sexual pleasure in these situations? How did this ever get into a UN-published manual? Now let's talk about negotiations. Let's talk about the resolution on preventing child mortality. The UN CRC committee issued a comment number 15, and that was being proposed to be adopted in this resolution. And it says that children have sexual and reproductive freedom. What does that mean? At what age do they have this freedom? That they should have confidential counseling advice without parental guardian or consent. Again, they must have this sexual education. They need all these health services, reproductive health services, without the permission of a parent, caregiver, or guardian. I would propose that this violates the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It says that parents have the prior right to choose the education for their children, and numerous other provisions that call for respect for the rights, responsibilities, and duties of parents. Again, we have the Bali Youth Declaration. It was sponsored by International Planned Parenthood and UNFPA. They issued a declaration that supposedly represented all the children in the world. And it says that governments must recognize that young people have autonomy over their bodies, their pleasures, and their desires. How young? And that governments must provide them all with comprehensive sexuality education. The WHO standards for sexuality education, they're starting at age zero, newborns. They need to learn about sexual pleasure and touching body parts, and masturbation and gender identity and all these controversial issues. And starting at age 4, they need to learn about same-sex relationships and all sorts of things at a very young age. And 6 through 9, they need to know all about contraception and, again, pleasure, all this kind of information. Age 9, all the gender orientation differences, sexual pleasure, masturbation. But here, the last point I want you to focus on, the WHO is saying that children need to be given information at age 9 about their sexual rights as defined by International Planned Parenthood. And you've seen what that looks like, the right to sexual pleasure and so forth. And age 15, it goes on, seeks to change gender and social norms, the way people think about sex, pregnancy, to question critically your cultural values. What are some things we can do? What can parents do? Going back to the pornography issue, discuss these things with your children. Discuss sexual relations, discuss your values, discuss what they're seeing on the internet, because you don't know if your child is going to be one of those children who is impacted negatively, like some of the people in this film. That doesn't happen to all children. But you need to help them process what they're seeing. They're going to see pornography. It's everywhere. If they're on the internet, they're going to see it. So talk to them about it. Talk to them how to handle accidental exposures. Limit their access to porn where you can. Put in filters. Don't hand them a smartphone. It's a pornography delivery mechanism, unless you put on some filters to help them. Know what your schools are teaching. Get involved in the schools. Invite your children to come talk to you if they have a problem. Be a safe place that they can come to. What can governments do? Beware of any ambiguous terms in the negotiations. These are common ones that are accepted by everybody. We put evolving capacities, or we give them confidentiality or privacy rights, or we put in sexuality education that's age-appropriate or as-appropriate or evidence-based or medically accurate. Well, the people who have the philosophies behind some of these sexuality education programs believe, as we learned, that children from birth have the capacity. It's age-appropriate from birth to be receiving these things. So these words can be meaningless upon implementation. So it's much better when negotiating provisions about sexuality education to change it to sex education, first of all, and to make sure that the rights of parents are recognized, and that no rights that would trump the right of parents, like confidentiality or privacy, are included in those paragraphs. Avoid granting children access to these things without recognizing the rights of parents to guide this. Rights should never be connected to sexual and reproductive health, because that equates to sexual rights. Sexual rights is the undefined, elastic, ambiguous term that can bring in all sorts of things that are counter to many of the religious and cultural values of UN member states. So we implore you, as the protectors of children, as negotiators who help
make the policies that affect children worldwide, to keep the protection of children against premature sexualization at the forefront of your radar screen. We want to also be clear that when we talk about all these programs, that we give you all these examples, that we consider any kind of sexual relations, it doesn't matter whether it's heterosexual or homosexual, any kind of sexual relations for children prematurely before they are married, outside of a marital bond, statistically shows that it will bring more negative outcomes to that child, to that person, and have repercussions moving on forward. And we'd be happy to show you those studies. So we would ask you again to protect children against the premature sexualization. We need to recognize the rights, duties, and responsibilities of parents. I'll just end with this quote. It says, "Truth does not become more true by virtue of the fact that the entire world agrees with it, nor less so even if the whole world disagrees with it." Even if something is in UN consensus language, that doesn't mean it has to be accepted if it's being redefined and being interpreted in new ways, which we find is constantly happening at the UN. So stand up alone if you have to protect children.